Immaculate, it's very humbling to follow you in this very important ceremony, and I want to thank you for reminding us all here today, as we have this focus on the 18th anniversary of the genocide. Thank you for reminding us why it's important for us all to take part in what you described as a war on memory, and the hurt that survivors feel when their pain and their suffering and their experiences are denied and diminished is reason alone for us to do everything that we can to preserve the memory of the genocide and to honour the victims in a dignified manner. And it was for that reason 10 years ago that when the government of Rwanda invited me and my brother and Aegis Trust to be involved in the development of the Kigali Genocide Memorial, we were very much honoured to be involved in that process of providing dignity for the victims and preserving memory. And one of the first challenges that I had in the development of the story and the narrative in the museum was that human rights organisations and journalists were constantly asking the question, what are we going to do to recognise the Hutu victims? Not the Hutu victims of the radical Hutu government, but Hutu victims of the RPF, and we had to give a lot of thought to this, and I discussed this with the government. And I drew from the experience that we'd had in running and founding the Holocaust Centre in the United Kingdom, because in our museum there in England and in Holocaust museums all around the world, including here in Washington, D.C., there is a very clear narrative. And there isn't mention, for example, of the German civilians that were killed by the Allied bombing campaigns in Dresden and other parts of Germany. Victims who were killed, civilians who were killed because they were targeted during the war. And nor do we tell the story of the German women that were raped by the Soviet army in the latter part of the war. And I take responsibility for that, being the chairman of the Holocaust Centre in the UK. And it isn't because Jewish lives are more important than German or Polish lives. And it isn't because I think that this part of history should be erased and that these people should be forgotten. There is a time and there is a place to tell these stories and to remember these people also. The reason those stories aren't side by side is for a specific reason. And it's that I want to talk about more today. But I'm going to do so by talking about it in the context, not of memory, but of denial, which of course go hand in hand, they're two sides of the same coin. Denial has many forms, as we've heard today, and the outright assertion that the killing didn't happen is easy to refute because the evidence is so overwhelming. But genocide denial is rarely confined to statements that deny the killing took place. Even yesterday there was yet another article published online by a well-known anti-Tutsi commentator who was questioning all sorts of facts about the genocide, including questioning whether the government of Habyarimana actually had a policy to persecute Tutsis at all. Of course, it was published on the eve of the Genocide Commemoration, I think specifically to cause that harm and that hurt to survivors. And what's much more difficult than this outright denial is the minimization and this shift of responsibility from the perpetrators. And it's about the language that's used, the relabeling of the situation. Not to talk about genocide or the crimes that were committed, but to talk about war, revenge, the age-old tribalism. It's a counterinsurgency. And all of this language change falls under the category of moral equivalence. And moral equivalence begins when the atrocities are taking place. We've seen that, and we've heard about this in the film and the discussions that were going on at the Security Council in 1994. And it's important to understand what the motive is behind that. And it is about governments. When there is a rebellion happening, they have a right to protect their sovereignty. But governments have no business in committing genocide. And international law draws a line under state sovereignty when states begin to kill their own civilians. And therefore it's important for governments that are perpetrating these crimes to keep the language about war, about counterinsurgency and about rebellion. But of course it continues long after the crimes have ended, for different reasons, about identity, who wants to be associated with, in their history, with these kind of crimes. But it's much more important to understand one of the motives is that minimizing, changing, deflecting away from the actual crimes and the intent to destroy a group of people is that as long as that history and that truth is there, it's an impediment. It's an impediment to people and to political parties who subscribe to the idea of exclusion and of extreme nationalism. And we see this in Europe. There are many examples of how far-right-wing organizations and governments try to minimize what happened, question the motives of the Nazis in destroying the Jews of Europe. Why? Because as long as that history is there, their exclusionary policies and their politics will be delegitimized. So they want to create a level playing field. And this is where the whole idea of double genocide comes in. Rwanda and the genocide of the Tutsis is not the only genocide where this double genocide theory exists. 5 years ago, it seemed, on the face of it, quite normal that when new nations, states that were joining the European Union, suggested that there is a new commemoration, a new day of remembrance, because we have the remembrance of the Holocaust. But why not remember all victims of totalitarianism in the Second World War in one convenient day of remembrance? It makes a lot of sense to politicians. It makes a lot of sense to policy people and to the media. After all, there's no hierarchy of suffering. No one person who died during that period is more important than another. And the European Parliament has agreed that there will be one day of remembrance as of 2008. But you see, there's a less noble reason behind this relativization of the genocide that took place of the Jews of Europe and others under the Nazis, and the crimes of the communists under Stalin. And it goes like this. The propaganda of the Nazis and the belief of a lot of Eastern European nations was that Jews were behind communism. And in fact, if you go to the United States Holocaust Museum and look at the exhibition on propaganda, you'll see there how right back in 1941, 1942, this was the intense narrative of the Nazis. The Jews are a threat to us because they bring communism. The Jews have enslaved us. The Jews have killed. The Jews are responsible for massacres. And therefore, in 1941, 1942, when the genocide of the Jews began, it was portrayed as an act of revenge, as retribution for their involvement in the threat that communism posed the rest of Europe. And this is a narrative that is growing in popularity in Eastern Europe, and it threatens to change the way in which the Holocaust will be remembered in Europe for generations to come. And so I see very much a parallel between this same argument of a double genocide. It's not because Tutsis are more important than Hutus. It's not about whether or not it's right to have inquiry into the details of history and how all these things happened and how the Civil War interacted with the genocide and the media and so on. Of course, these are all important, valid and legitimate. But when it diminishes, when it changes that big picture story to create a level playing field that, well, everybody's just as bad as each other anyway. What it does, it legitimizes those people who hold these views of exclusion and extremism, and we must guard against it with everything that we have. I just want to end on a short film, and this is to share with you here today, and be happy to discuss with you all later, about some of the plans that we have. Aegis Trust is working with the government of Rwanda to help combat denial by helping to record stories, helping to create an archive where documents can be kept for future generations to investigate for themselves about what happened and try to understand. And the Kigali Genocide Memorial is going to expand. There are plans, and what we're going to show you, what I'm just going to show you in a few minutes, is an artistic impression of how it might look. It'll be quite different actually to what you're going to see, because the city of Kigali is represented by hills and mountains. But the importance of all of this, and I would urge you, for those of you who aren't, please be in contact with Aegis Trust, and Eve, my colleague, is here today, and the organisers can put you in touch, to help support the kind of work that's going on here in the education. We've just done an evaluation of education about the genocide in Rwanda that takes place actually at the memorial, and what we found is young people today who were born after the genocide, many of them don't actually know the difference between genocide and a war. And this is because families aren't talking about it, communities aren't talking about it, and it's really important to have places like this, not only for the future generation in Rwanda to understand this difference, to help fight and equip them against the ideologies that are constantly growing and are prevalent. But this is important, as we heard from Immaculate, this is important for the whole world. It should be a place, an African centre for genocide prevention, but we can only do this. We can only do this if we first of all root it in the facts and equip young people to be able to withstand the myths and the lies and the half-truths that are so prevalent around this. So these are the plans that we hope will be developed over the next 3 or 4 years. At the Genocide Memorial in Kigali, somewhere there. Just while that's waiting, I'll just explain what you're going to see here is an impression of an expanded, for those of you who've been to the Genocide Memorial, you know this is a burial place of some 250,000 victims of the genocide. And there is a permanent museum exhibition there about the genocide and a small archive. Oh, not sure why you can't hear anything.